Welcome back to News and Views right here on Salam Media. Today we'll be turning our attention to a historic moment in Southern African history. Namibia has elected its first female president, Netumba Nandi-Ndaitwah, who's also the country's vice president and long-standing leader in the SWAPO party, with 57% of the vote. Her victory cements SWAPO's legacy while marking a significant milestone for gender representation in African leadership. And joining us to unpack this momentous development is Ashraf Patel. He's a research associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue, and together we'll explore what this election means for Namibia's political landscape, the broader implications for women in leadership across the continent, and also SWAPO's role in shaping Namibia's future. Ashraf, jazakallah so much for joining us. Welcome to Salam Media. Always a pleasure having you on board.
Thank you, Salelo. Much appreciated.
I think first and foremost, before we get into the Namibian elections, one thing that kind of stood out for me, just looking at the elections in the region, particularly the SADC region, is there's seemingly a shift, from the traditional liberation political parties. We currently see what's happening in Mozambique. I think Botswana also, same thing, the liberation movement. I think they were in power for more than 50 years. They've been booted out. The African National Congress, right here in South Africa, they've lost outright majority since democracy. There were assumptions that a similar scenario might present itself in Namibia, but that wasn't the case. But just generally, election season in the SADC region and the trends that we've been seeing, what can we make of them?
Yes, that's a very, very insightful comment, and not surprising. One must recall that 2024 has been a year of waves and waves of democracy across the world, including Southern Africa. And the trends essentially in the region are not surprising. Liberation parties across the region have seen a rapid decline, particularly in South Africa, Mozambique, to some extent in Namibia as well. But the election of Nandi-Ndaitwah as the first female president coming from SWAPO, from a liberation movement, is a huge boost for the kind of liberation movement discourse. And that is generally welcomed because what we've observed is these trends are driven by many centrifugal forces, and they are multifold. I think the first trend or driver on electoral disruptions in Southern Africa is governments that have come from liberation movements have kind of stagnated, they've fossilized, they've gotten quite cozy in terms of their rulings over the years. And with centrifugal forces, meaning the rapidly changing global economic and geopolitical environment is one such factor. The many wars and geopolitical contestations is another. But more significantly is the general failure of many of the ex-liberation movements or liberation movements in government to diversify their economies and to create sustainable growth and development. I think that is the big story. Very similar to the US election, it was less about the candidates, less about the parties, but more about the big headline day-to-day issues, and that is job creation, inflation, urbanization, skills development for the youth, and integrating women in the mainstream of society and the politics and economics. Those are the key issues facing liberation movements, and the electoral results or declining of the electoral results is the failure of ex-liberation or liberation movements in government to actually deliver on what is called the developmental dividend. People are tired of the democracy dividend. They want the development dividend, and these parties have generally not delivered.
Mm. I want to touch a bit on, just the historical significance. Nandi-Ndaitwah's election is groundbreaking in the sense that this is Namibia's first female president. How significant is this achievement for Namibia and just the broader Southern African region? Could we see a start where we have more female representation? We know here in South Africa, more than half of our parliament is comprised of females, but it doesn't necessarily always match when it comes to the upper echelons of leadership, where you ultimately have a female leading a political party or a female ultimately leading the country. Could this moment be that watershed moment that maybe sparks that kind of trend where we see more women having such positions?
Yes, it is welcoming, of course. Remember, we've had President Joyce Banda about a decade ago as president of Malawi. We have a female president in Tanzania currently. So there are trends, and this is most welcoming, of course. We need to integrate the broad agenda in politics, in civil society, in the economy, in academia. So these are all welcoming. And of course, it is time for reflection. The ANC, SWAPO, Frelimo, Botswana Democratic Party, they need to, as they go into the congresses and reflective period, they would have to do critical assessments and really understand the global trends, everything from climate change to technology to AI to youth mobilization to skills development to urbanization to the need to diversify the economies. These, and of course, good governance. Good governance is at the centerpiece of the number one issue facing most nations in Africa. So if they can get this balance right and work and deliver consistently, then they should be able to be in government for many years to come. But if they cannot, what's quite clear is the other side of the dynamic, the push and pull factor, is the consolidation of opposition. The growth of oppositions in Southern Africa is another big story. We've seen it particularly in Botswana, now in Namibia. You've seen the mushrooming of parties in South Africa and a resurgence in Mozambique. That suggests that opposition parties are definitely gaining momentum also through local discontent, but also many of them seem to be well resourced or funded. And that's another dynamic or story. And of course, researchers would have to dissect all these trends. What do they mean for the citizenry of these countries? But more importantly, the regions and the localities is where people cast their vote. So it's not about voting in the capitals or the big cities. What are the trends in the secondary towns, in the rural areas? This is where most of the African citizenry resides. This is where services and economic development needs to take place.
And just in closing, what does this peaceful transition of power and a relatively also peaceful election of a female leader teach us about the maturity of Namibia's democracy compared to others on the continent? Apart from the fact that maybe there wasn't a female leader in Mozambique, the transition, the elections were not necessarily smooth sailing. We know the situation in Zimbabwe also, where every time the elections, well, it's a well published narrative. The fact that they are not always free, they're not always fair. And in Botswana also there were some that were not really satisfied with how the elections
Mm.
panned out in that region. So, what can we make of this? What lessons are there, to learn from Namibia's democracy?
Yes, of course. Again, very welcoming, like Botswana and to a large extent South Africa. Peaceful elections is welcoming for everyone. Firstly, the citizens of the country, the labor force, the investors, and even the foreign partners, be they be partners from the EU, from the BRICS countries, from other parts of Africa. It's a good news story all round, but sobering for parties like SWAPO, ANC, BDC, Frelimo. They have lost on average 15% of the national electoral distribution, and that is cause for serious reflection. It does suggest a number of factors that is outlined, and they need to go back to the drawing board to reflect on voting patterns, on why voters voted this way, but also the overall stagnation. Once movements come into power, they stagnate. What does that mean? There's also the bigger issues of diversification away from natural resources or energy and oil and gas, which is the story of Angola, Namibia, as well as Botswana and Mozambique. These dependencies on natural resources alone may generate good foreign exchange, but that can create instability in what political scientists call the resource curse. And when you have more resources, as Angola do and Mozambique does, with new discoveries of oil and gas, it destabilizes the political system and creates civil wars, as we've seen. And if you cannot have good governance on natural resource governance systems and economic diversification strategies, as well as skills development, especially for the youth, and gender integration in the economy, without these drivers, you will get instability regardless of who is in power. So you need a new social compact post
Mm,
elections around economic diversification and development. So this is the story going forward for Southern Africa.
And I think you mentioned quite a few elements that these liberation movements need to go and reflect and look back on. But the question maybe that we can close the conversation with is there still a place for liberation movements across South Africa? Are they still relevant? Do they carry as much weight as they used to during the dark days of colonialism and apartheid, and maybe a few years beyond that? As you mentioned, the world is clearly evolving. The world is becoming increasingly integrated, and the ideas are crisscrossing. And one thing that I find with most of these liberation movements is they're almost cut from the same cloth. If you can look at the ANC, you look at Frelimo, you look at ZANU PF, it's almost the same parties with the same kind of mentality, and the way they also work with each other. They never hold each other accountable. They're always protecting each other, even when there's clear, transgressions against, their constituencies. I think, are we at a point where they just need to be phased out? You mentioned emerging political parties which are becoming well funded, and they are seemingly gunning for these liberation movements across the region.
Um, Liberation movements and parties will always be part of the body politic. They are relevant. They're undergoing disruption, which is healthy. It's bitter medicine, which is good. But they will always be there, and they will always remain relevant because of the challenges of sustainability, inequality, poverty, governance, and the historical legacy of Africa with the Africa Union. The 2063 agenda is rooted in the liberatory values of the liberation movement. So yes, they will always be relevant. Look, if you go to Europe, in Germany, the SDP, they've been in power for 100 years, on and off over the decades. The Labour Party in the UK, over 80 years. So they always go through cycles, strengths and shortcomings. And this is the nature of kind of multi-party democracy. But it's up to how strong they are to reflect the internal debates and how they can critically reflect on their mission, particularly in government, and take forward the vision and expectations of the people and citizens.
No, definitely. And I think we're going to leave here on that note. Ashraf, always a pleasure chatting to you and getting more insights
Thank you.
on, the ongoing, political, geopolitical occurrences. And I think the focus on the SADC region was one that was very, very interesting. But we're going to leave it there for now. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Have it. That was Ashraf Patel, Research Associate at the Institute of Global Dialogue. And with that being said, we have come to the end of today's edition of News and Views. We'll be back with you again tomorrow morning for the Thursday edition. But I'm not leaving you alone. I'm leaving you with one of my favorite segments. It's called hashtag Fired Up with African Muslims Agency's CEO, Imran Chunara. And today's topic is treat people based on who you are and not based on who they are. It's going to be an interesting one for myself, Salah, and the rest of the team. Sharp, sharp.